Hey, so I'm just going to read for 15 minutes out loud right now. The reason for this is because I want to improve on my speaking ability. I want to be able to articulate my thoughts better, and I don't want to freeze up when people ask me some deeper questions, and I just tend to just freeze up and then I stutter a lot. And I really want to stop doing that. I want to ascend and I want to improve myself, basically that. And today I will be reading the Penguin Classic edition of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Alrighty, let's start. Let me start the timer right now. Alrighty. The question of whether or not there exists a continuity of consciousness after death has been an important aspect of philosophical reflection and debate from ancient Indian times to the present. When considering these matters from a Buddhist perspective, a Buddhist point of view, however, we have to bear in mind that the understanding of the nature of continuity of consciousness and the understanding of the nature of the I or self are closely interlinked. Therefore, let us first look at what it is that can be said to constitute a person. According to Buddhist classical literature, a person can be seen as possessing five interrelated aggregates, technically known as the five psychophysical aggregates. These are the aggregate of consciousness, the aggregate of form, which includes our physical body and senses, the aggregate of feeling, the aggregate of discrimination, and the aggregate of motivational tendencies. That is to say, there is our body, the physical world, and our five senses. And there are various processes of mental activity, our motivational tendencies, our labeling of and discrimination between objects, our feelings, and the underlying awareness of consciousness, and the underlying awareness of or consciousness. Among the ancient schools of thought, which accepted the notion of continuity of consciousness, there were several non-Buddhist philosophical schools which regarded the entity, the I or self, which migrated from existence to existence as being unitary or permanent. They also suggest that this self was autonomous in its relationship to the psychophysical components that constitute a person. In other words, they believed or posited that there is an essence or soul of the person, which exists independently from body and the mind of the person. However, Buddhist philosophy does not accept the existence of such an independent autonomous entity. In the Buddhist view, the self or the person is understood in terms of a dynamic interdependent relationship of both mental and physical attributes. That is to say, psychophysical components which constitute a person. In other words, our sense or self can, upon examination, be seen as a complex flow of mental and physical events clustered in clearly identifiable patterns, including our physical features, instincts, emotions, and attitudes, etc., continuing through time. According to Prasangika Mahayap Mah, Mayap Mahap Mahyamaka philosophy, which has become the prevailing philosophical view of Tibetan Buddhism today. This sense of self is simply a mental construct, a mere label given to this cluster of dependently arising mental and physical events that is independence on their continuity. Now, when we look at this interdependent mental and physical constituents, let's redo that again. Now, when we look at this interdependence of mental and physical constituents from the perspective of the highest yoga tantra, there are two concepts of a person. One is the temporary person or self, that is, as we exist at the moment, that this is labeled on the basis of our coarse and gross physical body and conditioned mind. And at the same time, there is subtle person or self, which is designated in independence on the subtle body and subtle mind. The subtle body and subtle mind are seen as a single entity that has two facets. The aspect which has the quality of awareness, which can reflect and has the power of cognition, is the subtle mind. Simultaneously, there is its energy, and the force that activates the mind towards its object. This is the subtle body or subtle wind. These two inextricably conjoined qualities are regarded in highest yoga tantra as the ultimate nature of a person and are identified as Buddha nature, or the essence or actual nature of the mind. Now, before we look more closely at the nature of subtle body and subtle mind, let us look at how the gross body and subtle mind are thought to originate. The notion of dependent origination lies at the very heart of Buddhist philosophy. The principle of dependent origination asserts that nothing exists in its own right, independent of other factors. Things and events come into being only in dependence on the aggregation of multiple causes and conditions. The process through which the external world and the sentient beings within it revolve in a circle of existence propelled by karmic propensities and their interaction with misapprehension, attraction, and aversion. And condition is described in terms of 12 interdependent links. Each cycle of the process begins with misapprehension of the nature of reality, of actual reality. This fundamental ignorance acts as a condition for the rising of propensities created by our past actions, mental, verbal, and physical, which condition our dualizing consciousness. Our dualizing consciousness in turn conditions the quality and mode of interaction of our psychophysical aggregates, which condition which condition our sensory fields, which generate which generate contact, which generates sensation, and in turn attachment, grasping, the maturation towards rebirth. At this point, there is an interaction with the genetic constituents of the parents and subsequent interaction with its environment. And then finally, we have birth, aging, and death. This cycle can be viewed as both illustrating the underlying processes of life, death, and rebirth, and as an illustration of the processes to be transformed on the path to liberation from suffering in cyclic existence. The notion that there is a connection between this life and the events of both our previous existence and our future existence follows from the Buddhist understanding of the nature of the natural law of cause and effect. For example, although we can speak of yesterday's weather and today's weather as distinct, today's weather is inextricably linked with the weather patterns of yesterday, even at the bodily level. In the case of our physical health, for example, we know that events in the past affect the present, and those of the past, and those of the present, the future. Similarly, in the realm of consciousness, the Buddhist view is that there is also the same causal continuum between the events of the past, present, and future. The Buddhist understanding of the continuity of personal experience, including our memory, can be considered here. The Buddhist view is that the continuity of personal experience is primarily found on the capacity for retention, which can be further developed during one's meditative practice in this life. However, generally speaking, it is thought that if a person dies after a prolonged period of illness that has led to a prolonged degeneration of both physical and mental capacities, there would be a greater chance of many of the personal characteristics, including memories, being lost. On the other hand, in the case of someone who dies a sudden death, when the mind-body relationship at the gross level is still very firm, it is thought that there is a greater chance of carrying forward the acquired characteristics and memories, etc. Nonetheless, in both cases, the characteristics carried forward from a previous life are generally thought to be the most strongly felt at an early stage of one's rebirth. This is because the personal characteristics of the previous life are thought, generally speaking, to be quickly overwhelmed by the developing characteristics inherited from the parents of the present life. Nonetheless, as I've mentioned, much depends in this respect on the individual's capacity for recall, and this capacity for recall is dependent on a deepened retentive training acquired in this lifetime. Now let us look at the possible states of existence one can be born into. From a Buddhist perspective, rebirth and conditioned existence can take place in one of these three realms: the formless realm, the form realm, and or the desire realm. The form and formless realms are fruits of subtle states of consciousness attained upon the realization of certain meditative concentrations. Our realm, the desire realm, is the most gross of these three. 6 classes of beings are described as inhabiting the desire realm: God, mundane, celestial beings whose primary mental state is exaltation; anti-God, who are predominantly hostile and jealous; human beings, who are influenced by all the 5 dissonant mental states; animals, who are under the sway of delusion; anguished spirits, who are under the sway of attachment and unsatisfying craving; and hell. That is my alarm. Alright, I guess that's it for today.